It was past midnight when the hospital finally grew quiet. The hallways, usually buzzing with voices, hurried footsteps, and the constant rush of doctors and nurses, had fallen into an almost eerie silence. Only the machines remained alive, their steady beeping echoing through the dimly lit corridors. Each sound was like a heartbeat, reminding me that somewhere behind those closed doors, lives were still hanging in the balance. As I walked down the long hallway, the click of my shoes on the cold, polished floor became the loudest sound around me. Every step echoed back at me, bouncing off the walls and reminding me how empty the place felt at that hour. During the day, the hospital was full of movement and noise, patients talking, families waiting anxiously, staff hurrying between rooms, but once night settled in, everything seemed to slow down. The building itself seemed to breathe differently, heavy and tired, like it was resting from the chaos of the day. Being on night duty was never easy. The hours felt longer than they truly were. The darkness outside the windows made time seem frozen, as though the world beyond the hospital no longer existed. The loneliness wrapped itself around me, pressing against my shoulders and chest. Unlike during the day, there were no cheerful greetings, no small conversations with colleagues in passing. At night, it was just me, the patients, and the endless silence broken only by the hum of air vents and the beeping of machines. There was also a kind of heaviness that came with working at night. Maybe it was the quiet itself that made every task feel harder. Or maybe it was the weight of knowing that most people in the city were asleep, safe in their homes, while I remained awake, carrying responsibility for lives that could change in an instant. The shadows in the hallways seemed deeper, the air colder, and the silence heavier than at any other time of day. Sometimes, as I walked those empty corridors, I felt like the last person left in the world. The faces of my patients drifted through my mind, those who were sleeping soundly, those who were restless and in pain, and those who might not live to see the morning. Every monitor's beep felt like a reminder of how fragile life really is. It was strange how the machines, not people, became my companions at night. They spoke in steady rhythms, their sounds almost like whispers in the dark. Night duty also tested my emotions in ways daytime never did. The stillness magnified my thoughts, my worries, and even my fears. A patient's sudden cry, the alarm of a machine, or the unexpected ringing of a phone in the nurse's station would cut through the silence and send my heart racing. I had to remind myself to stay calm, to stay steady, because in the quiet of the night, every reaction felt magnified and patients needed me to be strong. And yet, despite the loneliness and heaviness, there was something uniquely powerful about those midnight hours. In that silence, I felt a deep connection to my work. There was no rush of visitors, no noise from crowded waiting rooms, just me and the people who needed care. Sometimes, in those moments, I realized that true compassion often grew strongest in the stillness of the night. When a frightened patient needed reassurance, when an elderly man whispered that he couldn't sleep, or when someone cried softly into their pillow, I was there. In that quiet, my presence meant everything. As the night stretched on, I often caught myself glancing at the clock, watching the minutes crawl by. But then I reminded myself that every second mattered. Behind every door, lives were unfolding in silence, healing, breaking, or fighting to continue. The loneliness of the corridor was heavy. Yes, but it was also sacred. It was in those hours that I understood the depth of responsibility I carried and the quiet strength it demanded. By the time dawn slowly crept through the hospital windows, bringing with it the sounds of footsteps, voices, and new energy, I often felt both exhausted and strangely proud. The night had been long, heavy, and lonely, but I had walked through it. The beeping of the monitors, the echo of my footsteps, and the silence of the empty corridors had been my companions through the darkness, and together we had made it to morning. It was 1:37 in the morning when the shrill sound of the red phone broke the silence of the hospital. That phone almost never rang unless something serious had happened. My heart jumped as I reached for it, because I knew the call would not be ordinary. On the other end, A voice quickly explained that an ambulance was on its way. A man had been in a terrible accident. He was unconscious, bleeding heavily, and his condition was critical. In that instant, the quiet hospital hallway no longer felt still. The silence shattered, replaced by a rush of urgency inside me. I could almost hear my own heartbeat racing faster than the ticking of the wall clock. Even though my body felt heavy with fatigue from the long night shift, my mind snapped into focus. There was no time to waste. A life was hanging in the balance and I had to be ready. I steadied myself. Years of training had taught me that panic could never be an option. Patients depended on us to stay calm when everything around them fell apart. So I pushed away my fear, straightened my posture, and began preparing for what was about to come. I washed my hands quickly, adjusted my gloves, and mentally reviewed the steps I might need to take. Stop the bleeding, check his airway, stabilize his vital signs, and prepare for immediate treatment. As I moved through the motions, I reminded myself of something I had always believed. At night, in a hospital, every minute can decide the difference between life and death. Time seemed to stretch and shrink at once. The ambulance was only minutes away, but those minutes felt like hours. I could already imagine the patient, his face pale, his body limp, his life slipping away with every drop of blood. When I thought about him, I didn't see a stranger. I thought about how, somewhere in the city, someone might be waiting for him. Maybe he had a wife who was pacing the floor, a mother praying for his safety, or children sleeping peacefully without knowing their father's life was hanging by a thread. He wasn't just a male victim. He was someone's whole world, and that thought fueled my determination even more. The staff began moving quickly, each of us falling into the rhythm we knew so well. A stretcher was prepared, surgical kits laid out, blood bags readied. The emergency team worked in silence, but it was not an empty silence. It was filled with purpose. We didn't need many words. We all understood what had to be done. Inside me there was a mixture of fear and strength. Fear because I knew how badly this man was injured, and strength because I had chosen this profession for nights like these. Nights when life dangled by a fragile thread and my hands could help keep it from breaking. Finally, I heard the distant wail of the ambulance siren, growing louder and louder until it stopped outside the emergency doors. The rush of footsteps followed, and then I saw him, the accident victim. His body was covered in blood, his clothes torn, his face swollen. For a second the sight was overwhelming, but I forced myself to focus. He was not just a broken body. He was a life that deserved every ounce of effort I could give. As they wheeled him toward me, I placed a hand on the stretcher and whispered to myself, "Stay steady. Fight for him. Don't let fear take over." My hands trembled for only a moment before they became firm again. I knew that in the next few hours every decision, every movement, every breath I took would matter. At 1:37 a.m. the night had changed. The stillness of the hospital was gone, replaced by the sound of rushing feet, urgent voices, and the steady beeping of monitors being attached to his body. And in the center of all of it I stood, ready to fight for his life, holding on to the belief that sometimes, courage in the darkest hours can become the thin line between death and survival. The stretcher burst through the emergency room doors, the nurses rushing with urgency as the wheels rattled loudly against the tiled floor. My eyes fixed on the figure lying there, his body pale, his chest rising and falling weakly beneath the support of the oxygen mask. For a split second I saw only a patient. Another life I had to save. Another human being who had been caught in the cruelty of fate. But then my eyes truly focused, and my entire world tilted on its axis. I froze. My breath caught in my throat as though the air itself had been stolen from the room. The face beneath the bruises, the man hidden under tubes and bandages, was not a stranger. No, it was a face I knew better than I had ever wanted to admit. It was the face of someone who had once been my everything. Lying before me, unconscious and broken, was my college sweetheart. Memories crashed into me like a wave, blinding and sharp. I remembered the way he used to laugh under the spring sun on campus lawns, the way his hand felt when it found mine between long walks from class to class. I remembered the sound of his voice whispering late-night dreams about a future we never built. Years had passed, yet in that moment, all the carefully locked doors in my heart burst open, and the pieces of our history came flooding out. My knees felt weak. For a second, I thought I might collapse under the weight of shock and emotion. I wanted to scream, to cry, to run, but I couldn't. The room was spinning, but the reality was unshakable. The man I once loved was now the man whose life was literally in my hands. There was no time to process, no space to drown in my emotions. I was a doctor on duty, and he was a patient who desperately needed me. But how could I separate my shaking heart from my steady hands? I looked at his face again, searching through the blood and bruises for the boy I once knew. There he was, faint traces of the same soft jawline, the same curve of his lips, even the same scar near his eyebrow from the time he tripped while running across the campus field. He looked older, tired, and broken, but it was him. I knew it with a certainty that ripped me apart inside. The nurses called my name, waiting for instructions. Their voices snapped me back to the present. I swallowed hard, pushing down the storm of emotions threatening to swallow me. This was not the time for the past. Right now, this wasn't about the love we lost, the heartbreak we endured, or the years we had been apart. This was about saving his life. Still inside me, a battle raged. My heart whispered questions I had no time to answer. Why here? Why now? What twist of fate brought him back into my world like this? I wanted to touch his hand, to whisper his name, to demand why he had walked out of my life all those years ago. But those desires clashed against the hard truth that I was no longer his lover. I was his doctor, and if I lost control, he might lose his chance to survive. I steadied myself with a deep breath. "Let's get him stabilized," I ordered, forcing my voice to sound firm. I watched as the team followed my lead, attaching 4 lines, checking blood pressure, preparing transfusions. My eyes never left him, though. Even as I moved mechanically through my training, my soul trembled with the weight of recognition. It felt unreal. Of all the patients in the city, of all the emergencies that could have happened, fate had chosen him to come crashing back into my life at 1:37 a.m. under the harsh fluorescent lights of a hospital room. My past and present collided in the most painful, surreal way imaginable. And as I stood over him guiding the team, I whispered silently in my heart, "Please don't die. Not like this. Not before I can understand why fate has brought you back to me." The moment I stood over him with the scalpel in my hand, my mind became a battlefield between the past and the present. My eyes were on his broken body, but my thoughts were pulled backward, dragged through years of memories I thought I had buried. His smile was the first thing that came to me, bright and carefree, the kind of smile that used to light up entire rooms. I remembered how it felt to sit beside him on campus benches, hearing his laughter spill out like music that belonged only to me. That smile had once been my safe place, my comfort in a world that often felt uncertain. Then his voice echoed in my mind, deep, warm, unforgettable. I remembered how he would call my name as though no one else in the world existed. I remembered our endless conversations, about dreams, about life, about silly little things that didn't matter yet somehow meant everything. Even now, years later, the memory of his voice was so alive that it pierced me. It was almost cruel, hearing him in my head while in reality he lay silent and unconscious on the operating table. A mask covering the mouth that once whispered promises to me. And then the day he left. That day came crashing back into me with the same sharpness it had when it first happened. No warning. No explanation. Just absence. One moment we were building a future together, and the next, he was gone, leaving behind only questions and a hollow ache in my chest that had taken years to stop bleeding. I had cried until there were no more tears left, searched for answers that never came, and told myself I had to let him go. But letting go of someone who had once been the center of your world is like learning how to breathe underwater. It feels impossible. All of this, the smile, the voice, the abandonment, flashed through my mind in fragments, like pieces of broken glass catching light. And yet, here I was holding a scalpel, my hand steady despite the storm raging inside me. Fate, in its cruel and twisted way, had returned him to me. Not as the lover, not as the boy who once held my heart, but as a patient whose life depended on me. The weight of that realization was unbearable. I had spent years wondering what I would say if I ever saw him again. I had imagined scenarios where I confronted him, demanded answers, poured out all the pain he had caused me. I had also imagined softer moments. What if he apologized? What if he confessed that leaving had been a mistake? But none of those imagined moments looked anything like this. I had never once pictured him lying broken and bleeding, his survival hinging on the precision of my hands. I stared down at the scalpel, the small, sharp instrument that could mean the difference between life and death. It felt heavier than it ever had before. Because this time, it wasn't just about skill or training. This time it was personal. This was the man who had once shattered me, and now fate had thrown him back into my hands. I asked myself silently, could I save him without letting my feelings consume me? Could I separate the doctor from the woman who had once loved him? The questions clawed at me, but there was no time for hesitation. Lives aren't saved by nostalgia or heartbreak. They're saved by action. And if I faltered, if I allowed myself to drown in the past, I would lose him again. Only this time to death. My chest burned with conflicting emotions. Part of me wanted to scream, to throw down the scalpel, to demand answers right there and then, even if he couldn't speak. Another part of me, the stronger part, reminded me that this was not about me. This was about him and the fight for his life. Whatever had happened between us before no longer mattered in this moment. What mattered was that he was here, breathing faintly, his heart still beating, his body still clinging to life. So I steadied myself, blocking out the flood of memories that threatened to drown me. My hands were steady, my training guiding me like a lighthouse in the storm. I pressed forward, knowing that in this strange, surreal twist of fate, I had been given both a burden and a gift, the chance to save the very man who once broke my heart. And as the scalpel touched his skin, one truth echoed in my mind. Fate is not always kind, but it is always purposeful. The surgery was nothing short of brutal. From the moment the first incision was made, the weight of responsibility pressed down on me harder than ever before. His injuries were worse than I had imagined when they first wheeled him in. Blood loss was severe, bones fractured, and his organs were struggling to keep going. The monitors beeped in erratic rhythms, each sound cutting into my chest like a blade. My hands moved with precision, but my heart was pounding as if it wanted to break free. Every decision mattered. Every second mattered. The room was filled with chaos. Nurses handing me instruments, the anesthesiologist calling out vitals, assistants suctioning blood to keep the field clear. The air smelled of antiseptic, sweat, and fear. I tried to focus only on the surgical field, but deep inside me, memories fought to distract me. This wasn't just a patient. This wasn't just another man on the table. This was him, the boy I had once loved, the man who had left me shattered. And now, here I was, the only barrier between him and death. Then it happened. The flat, terrifying sound I never wanted to hear pierced the room. His heart had stopped. The monitor screamed a long, continuous beep that made the world feel as though it had ended in that very moment. My breath froze in my lungs. I had faced cardiac arrests before, but this one was different. This was personal. My hands moved automatically, compressions, injections, everything we could do. But my soul cried out louder than any medical order I could give. In silence, within the walls of my own mind, I begged him, "Don't you dare leave me again." The words repeated like a desperate prayer. Not like this. Not without answers. Not without a chance for me to tell you everything I've carried all these years. My throat tightened, but I couldn't stop. I begged him with every push of my hands, with every beat I tried to force back into his heart. And then, against the odds, the monitor blipped. One weak beat, then another, until slowly, a rhythm returned. He came back. Relief washed over me, so powerful it nearly broke my composure. But I couldn't celebrate. Not yet. The surgery wasn't over, and fate wasn't done testing me. Minutes later, his heart faltered again. The same dreadful silence filled the room, followed by the same shrill flatline. My chest tightened so much it hurt. No, not again. Please. Not again. My hands trembled for a fraction of a second before I steadied them. I pushed harder, fought harder. My silent pleas grew louder inside me. You left me once. You walked away without a word. But I won't let you leave me like this. Not cold. Not lifeless. Not when fate brought you back to me. Tears blurred my vision for a moment, but I blinked them away, focusing on the task. My voice, though tight, gave out firm commands to the team. Adrenaline, compressions, shock. We threw everything we had at him. And then, like a miracle, his heart responded again. The beeping monitor resumed its steady song. Weak but present. Fragile but alive. A rush of air left my lungs in a shaky sigh. For a moment my knees felt like they might give way. But I held myself upright. I couldn't afford to crumble, not yet. The surgery was far from easy, and every cut, every stitch felt like a war I was fighting both with and against destiny. But in that moment, something shifted inside me. It wasn't just about saving a patient anymore. It wasn't even just about saving a man I had once loved. It was about fighting for closure, for answers, for the strange twist of fate that had dropped him back into my world when I least expected it. Somewhere deep down, I knew this night would change everything. And as the final sutures were made, as the bleeding slowed and his heartbeat held steady on the monitor, I whispered inside myself again, this time not with desperation but with quiet determination. You came back. Maybe not for me. Maybe not for love. But you came back. And this time I won't let fate take you so easily. After hours of relentless work, the storm finally began to calm. His heartbeat, which had betrayed us twice during surgery, now held steady on the monitor. The jagged lines danced in fragile but reassuring rhythms. His breathing, supported by tubes and machines, rose and fell with a slow, steady pattern. For the first time since he had been wheeled in, I allowed myself to believe he might live. He was no longer teetering on the edge of death. He had stabilized. When the last of the instruments were set aside and the room cleared, silence returned. Not the terrifying silence of a flatline, but the softer, almost sacred silence of a hospital at rest. I sank into the chair beside his bed, my body collapsing under the weight of hours of tension. My bones ached. My shoulders felt like lead. Even my hands, trained for endurance, trembled from the unyielding grip I had held on the scalpel. Every muscle screamed with exhaustion, yet my eyes refused to close. I could not leave him, not yet. So I sat there staring at him. The man who had once been my everything lay pale and fragile beneath the white sheets, his chest rising and falling like the tide, slow, steady, life-giving. Every movement of his chest felt like a victory, each inhale and exhale proof that he had survived what should have taken him away. I should have felt only relief, but inside me a storm still raged. Memories clashed with reality. The boy I loved, the man who left me, the patient I had just fought to keep alive. They were all the same person, and reconciling that truth was almost unbearable. I leaned forward, resting my elbows on my knees, trying to steady my own breathing. And that was when I felt it, the hot streak of tears sliding down my face. I hadn't even realized I was crying until I tasted salt on my lips. My hands, so used to saving others, trembled as I reached up to wipe them away. But the tears wouldn't stop. They flowed freely, carrying years of buried pain, Anger, love, and confusion. Why was I crying? Was it relief that he had survived? Was it anger at the cruelty of fate for bringing him back into my life this way? Was it grief for the years lost? For the unanswered questions? For the ghost of the relationship we once had? Or was it simply the exhaustion of a woman who had given everything in one night, only to realize that her heart had been reopened in the process? As I watched him, unconscious and unaware of my presence, I couldn't help but remember the way I used to watch him in college. Back then I had watched him laugh with friends, his head thrown back, his eyes shining with dreams. I had watched him walk toward me across the campus lawn, his arms opening to gather me in. Now, years later, I watched him again, but this time he lay still, his body weak, his face marked by pain. The contrast nearly broke me. I wanted to speak, to pour out everything I had held in since the day he walked away without explanation. I wanted to whisper his name, to tell him how much he had hurt me, how much I had missed him, how much I hated him for making me feel like this again. But my lips stayed sealed. The room didn't need my words. It only needed the quiet rhythm of his breathing, and the steady pulse of the monitor that told me he was still here. The exhaustion etched into my bones grew heavier with every passing minute, but I could not leave his side. I felt as though if I took my eyes off him, if I allowed myself to rest, he might slip away again. So I sat there, shoulders slumped, hands limp in my lap, tears carving lines down my cheeks. In that quiet moment, stripped of noise and duty, I realized something important. I wasn't just crying for him. I was crying for me. For the girl I used to be, for the years I had spent carrying unanswered questions, for the pieces of my heart I thought I had buried. Fate had reopened everything tonight, and I was powerless against it. So I stayed by his side, exhausted but unyielding, watching the fragile rise and fall of his chest. And with every breath he took, I whispered silently through my tears, "You survived. Don't leave me again." Morning crept into the hospital slowly, like a gentle hand brushing away the darkness. The first rays of sunlight streamed through the tall windows of the ward, soft and golden, spilling across the white floor tiles and sterile sheets. The light carried with it a strange sense of peace, almost as if it had come to remind me that the longest night was finally over. The monitors still hummed quietly, steady and faithful, but the harshness of the night had given way to something gentler. I sat slumped in the chair beside his bed, my body still heavy with exhaustion, my eyelids burning from the weight of staying awake for so many hours. My head had fallen back at some point, and though I wasn't truly asleep, I hovered in that fragile space between wakefulness and dreaming. Every time the monitor beeped, I stirred slightly, reassured that he was still alive. Even in half-sleep, my ears clung to that sound like it was the most important melody in the world. And then a movement startled me. His hand twitched ever so slightly against the sheet. I leaned forward quickly, not sure if my tired eyes were playing tricks on me. But then his eyelids fluttered, the lashes trembling with effort as if it took every bit of strength to push back the darkness that had held him for so long. I held my breath. Time slowed. For a moment it felt like the entire hospital stilled with me, waiting. Finally, his eyes opened. Slowly, painfully, but unmistakably they opened. The man I thought I had lost forever, not just last night but years ago, was staring back at me. His gaze was hazy, unfocused at first, like someone waking from the deepest sleep. But then his eyes found me, and when recognition sparked within them, I felt a jolt in my chest so strong it almost stole my breath away. Shock rippled across his face. His lips parted slightly, and his eyes widened as if he couldn't quite believe what he was seeing. I could read the silent question in his expression. "Why are you here? How could it be you?" I wanted to look away, to shield myself from the flood of emotions rushing through me, but I couldn't. My body was rooted to the spot, my heart pounding so loudly I was sure he could hear it through the monitors. I had braced myself for this moment, imagined how I would feel if he woke, but no amount of preparation could have softened the force of reality. And then he whispered. His voice was weak, cracked from the dryness of his throat and the strain of his injuries, but those 3 words reached me clearer than any sound I had ever heard. You saved me. The words hung in the air, fragile yet powerful, wrapping themselves around my heart. I wanted to answer immediately, to tell him it wasn't just me, that it had been the whole team, that I had only done my duty as a doctor. But my throat closed up. My lips trembled, because I knew he wasn't just talking about the surgery. He was talking about the night I refused to let him slip away. He was talking about the tears I shed when I begged him silently not to leave me again. He was talking about the girl I had been in college, the girl who once loved him with everything she had, the girl he had walked away from. Somehow in his broken state he recognized all of that in my eyes. And he named it in those 3 words. A dozen emotions fought inside me. Relief washed over me first, pure and overwhelming. I had kept him alive. He was here breathing, speaking. That was enough for now. But mingled with that relief was pain. The pain of hearing his voice again after so many years. The pain of knowing the depth of history between us. The pain of realizing that no matter how much time had passed, he could still stir me with nothing more than a whisper. I reached for his hand without thinking, my fingers brushing lightly against his. His skin was cold but alive. I wanted to tell him everything I had carried all these years. The unanswered questions, the sleepless nights, the broken pieces of my heart. But the words wouldn't come. Instead, I just held his gaze. And in that golden morning light, with the weight of night finally lifting, I realized something. This wasn't just a reunion. It was a reckoning. Fate had placed him back in my life, not as a lover, not as a memory, but as a patient whose life I had saved. The story between us wasn't finished, and whether I liked it or not, a new chapter had just begun. The moment I saw his eyes open and heard him whisper that I had saved him, my heart twisted. For a brief second there was relief and tenderness, but almost instantly something else rushed in. It was a wave I had tried to hold back for years. A storm I thought I had buried deep inside me where it could never rise again. But seeing him alive, hearing his voice, and realizing how close I had been to losing him, it cracked something open. Suddenly, all the anger I had locked away came surging back to the surface. I leaned forward, my voice shaking. Not because I didn't know what I wanted to say, but because the emotions were too heavy to carry. Why did you leave me? I asked, my words trembling in the stillness of the hospital room. Why did you disappear? The questions had lived inside me for so long, festering quietly in the corners of my heart. Night after night, I had replayed the day he walked away, searching for reasons, inventing excuses, trying to make sense of the emptiness he left behind. I had whispered those same questions into the silence of my room when no one was listening, but now, for the first time, I said them out loud to him. My voice cracked under the weight of it. I didn't just sound angry. I sounded broken. Because beneath the rage was the truth. I had loved him. I had trusted him. And when he vanished from my life without explanation, it hadn't just hurt. It had shattered me in ways no one else could see. For a second I thought he might answer. His chest rose, and his lips parted slightly as if he was about to speak. My heart pounded, waiting. I wanted the truth, even if it was cruel. Even if it tore me apart again. I wanted to know if I had done something wrong, if there had been someone else, if his love had ever been real at all. But then slowly, almost painfully, he turned his face away from me. His eyes shifted toward the window where the morning light spilled in, and he said nothing. Silence. Only silence. That silence cut deeper than any words ever could. It wasn't just an absence of sound, it was an answer in itself. His refusal to face me, his choice to turn away, was like another wound layered on top of the old one. After everything that had happened, after I had fought to keep him alive with my own hands, he still wouldn't give me the dignity of the truth. My throat tightened, and I felt the sting of tears threatening to fall. I hated that he still had this power over me, That even after years of trying to build myself back up, a single look, or the lack of one, could undo me so completely. Inside, a battle raged. One part of me screamed to let it go, to remember that he was my patient now, not the man I once loved. But another part, the younger version of me who had once held his hand and believed in forever, demanded answers. That younger me deserved to know why her world had been ripped apart without explanation. The silence grew heavier, pressing down on the room like an invisible weight. The beeping of the monitors, once comforting, now felt like sharp reminders of the gulf between us. He was alive, yes, but the man I had loved seemed farther away than ever. I clenched my fists, forcing myself to breathe slowly, to steady the storm inside me. But the truth was unavoidable. I was no longer just the doctor who saved his life. I was also the woman he had once abandoned, standing in front of him, still demanding the closure I had been denied for years. And as he turned his face away, I realized something bitter. Maybe he would never give me that closure. Maybe the answers I had been waiting for didn't exist. Or worse, maybe he simply didn't care enough to share them. The anger inside me burned hotter, but beneath it was something colder, sharper: disappointment. Not just disappointment in him, but in myself for still hoping, even after all this time, that he would turn back and give me the truth I craved. I sat there in that chair, watching his face turned away from me, and understood one thing with painful clarity. Saving his life had been my duty as a doctor. But saving myself from him, that was a battle I would still have to fight. That night, after hours of silence hanging between us like an unspoken wall, he finally spoke. His voice was weak, almost hesitant, like each word was being pulled out of him with great effort. I sat in the chair by his bedside, my body tense, my mind still swirling with anger and unanswered questions. I had begged him for an explanation years ago, and again earlier that day, only to be met with silence. But now at last he was ready to tell me the truth. I was diagnosed with a heart condition, he whispered. His eyes didn't quite meet mine, as if he was afraid to see my reaction. For a moment I couldn't process what he had said. A heart condition? My chest tightened as the weight of those words settled over me. All the years of confusion, of feeling unwanted, of wondering what I had done wrong. It all collided with this revelation. He hadn't left me because of another woman. He hadn't left because he had stopped loving me. He had left because he was sick. Because his own heart was failing him. He took a shaky breath before continuing. I couldn't drag you into a life of hospitals and pain. His words were thick with guilt, with sorrow, with a kind of love that felt twisted and self-destructive. I didn't want you to spend your youth watching me suffer, waiting for the day my heart would give out. I thought leaving you was the kindest thing I could do. I stared at him, my mind a storm of emotions. On one hand, I wanted to scream, to ask him why he didn't trust me enough to make that choice for myself, to demand why he thought disappearing without a word was better than honesty. He had left me to suffer years of uncertainty, heartbreak, and self-blame, all because he assumed I couldn't handle the truth. On the other hand, I felt my anger softening ever so slightly, as I saw the pain etched on his face. He hadn't stopped loving me. He had loved me so much that he believed letting me go was an act of mercy. But in trying to protect me, he had broken me. My mind flashed back to the nights I had cried myself to sleep, convinced I wasn't good enough, convinced there must have been something wrong with me for him to vanish the way he did. I had carried that wound for years, never knowing it wasn't rejection. It was sacrifice, or at least what he thought was sacrifice. Still, the wound was real. The damage was real. His intention didn't erase the loneliness, the unanswered questions, the hollow ache of abandonment. I swallowed hard, my throat thick with emotions I couldn't name. So you thought love wasn't enough? I asked quietly, my voice shaking. You thought I wouldn't have chosen you anyway? That I would have walked away if I knew the truth? His eyes finally lifted to mine, and for the first time, I saw them glisten with tears. I thought you deserved better than a future chained to hospital beds and medications. I thought you deserved someone whole. The room went quiet again, but this time the silence was different. It wasn't empty, it was heavy, filled with the weight of everything we had lost, everything we could never get back. I leaned back in the chair, my heart torn between two truths. He had left me because he loved me, and yet, his love had still left me broken. For years I had believed love wasn't enough because he had abandoned me. Now I realize he had abandoned me because he believed love wasn't enough. And in that painful, ironic twist, we had both been wronged, not by each other's hearts, but by the fear that love alone couldn't withstand suffering. As I sat there watching him struggle to breathe, I felt a strange mix of sorrow and clarity. His choice had shaped both our lives. His silence had been a wound. But now, with his truth laid bare, I finally understood. He hadn't left because I wasn't enough. He left because he thought he wasn't. And though the years between us could never be undone, that single truth began to stitch together a small piece of my broken heart. I thought hatred would come easily. After all, I had every reason to resent him. He had disappeared from my life without a single explanation, leaving me to wrestle with unanswered questions, sleepless nights, and the deep wound of abandonment. For years I carried that hurt like a scar across my heart. I believed he had walked away because I wasn't enough, because our love wasn't worth fighting for. And because of that, I convinced myself that if I ever saw him again, my first reaction would be anger. But the truth was so different. When I saw him lying there in the hospital bed, pale and weak, the anger I thought I had saved for him dissolved instantly. He didn't look like the man who had left me behind. He looked fragile, broken, and more human than I had ever seen him. His strength, the confidence he once carried so easily, was gone. All that remained was vulnerability, and in that moment I couldn't summon hatred. Instead, something inside me cracked. My heart didn't harden, it shattered. Because now I knew the truth. He hadn't left because he stopped loving me. He had left because he was suffering silently and alone. He had carried the weight of his illness by himself, believing it was his burden to bear. And that realization pierced me more deeply than his absence ever had. I thought about the nights I had spent crying, wondering why I wasn't enough, while at the very same time, he might have been awake too, battling pain, fear, and the cruel uncertainty of a failing heart. While I was blaming myself, he was trying to shield me from a future he thought would only bring me suffering. We had been living two separate kinds of heartbreak, and neither of us knew about the other's pain. Seeing him so vulnerable forced me to confront my own emotions in ways I wasn't ready for. I wanted to cling to my anger. It was safer, easier. Anger gave me power when I had once felt powerless. But sorrow was heavier, more honest. It reminded me that beneath all the hurt, I still cared for him. I still loved him. And love, no matter how bruised, made it impossible to hate him. As I watched him struggle to breathe, I realized just how much he must have endured without me. How many doctor's visits, sleepless nights, and terrifying moments had he faced alone? How many times had he wanted to call me, to tell me, but stopped himself because he believed he was sparing me? That thought broke me. It wasn't just that he had suffered. It was that he had chosen to suffer in silence, carrying a weight we could have shared. And so my heart shattered in a different way. Not from abandonment this time, but from the deep ache of knowing that someone I once loved with all my being had walked through years of darkness without letting me in. He had shut me out, not because he didn't care, but because he cared too much. And that twisted form of love was both tragic and cruel. I wanted to yell at him, to tell him how unfair it was, how much he had hurt me by taking away my choice. But instead, all I felt was a wave of compassion that drowned out the anger. He wasn't a villain in my story. He was just a flawed, frightened human being who had tried to protect me the wrong way. And in that moment, sitting beside him with tears stinging my eyes, I realized something important. Hatred would have been easier, but it wouldn't have been true. The truth was I couldn't hate him. Not when I saw how broken he was. Not when I finally understood how alone he had been. My heart may have shattered, but it shattered with love, grief, and empathy, not anger. Because sometimes the deepest pain comes not from betrayal, but from love that is forced into silence. And that was the pain we both carried. As the days passed and his strength slowly returned, something unexpected began to happen between us. The hospital was supposed to be a place of healing, a space where rules and boundaries were carefully enforced, but in those long quiet nights, the walls seemed to soften. He was no longer just a patient lying in the bed, and I was no longer just the doctor watching over him. We became two people with a shared history, trying to navigate emotions that had never truly disappeared. At night, when the ward grew silent and the only sounds were the rhythmic beeps of monitors and the occasional footsteps of nurses, we found ourselves talking in whispers. Our conversations weren't grand or dramatic. They were gentle, hesitant, like two people relearning a language they once spoke fluently but hadn't practiced in years. We talked about small things at first, the weather, the food, the news, but eventually the words grew deeper. Memories slipped into the spaces between us. The way he used to make me laugh in college, the songs we once listened to together, the dreams we had once shared before everything fell apart. Those whispered conversations felt fragile, like glass that could shatter at the slightest wrong move. And yet there was comfort in them too. They reminded me of the person I had once loved, the boy who had stolen my heart before illness and fear had turned him into a stranger. Slowly, without even meaning to, the embers of that old love began to glow again. It wasn't just in the words we spoke. It was in the way his eyes lingered on me when he thought I wasn't looking. It was in the small smile that tugged at his lips whenever our hands brushed accidentally as I adjusted his blanket or checked his fur. It was in the way I found myself looking forward to those late-night hours, when the world seemed to shrink down to just the two of us and the rest of life. Our pain, our past, even the hospital itself, faded into the background. But with every stolen glance, with every whispered confession, a quiet conflict grew inside me. The hospital had strict rules about relationships between doctors and patients. Intimacy of any kind was forbidden. It was unprofessional, dangerous even, because emotions could cloud judgment. And I knew all of this. I had built my career on discipline, on drawing firm lines between my personal and professional life. I knew better than to let my heart wander where it shouldn't. Yet, despite everything I knew, my heart betrayed me. It reached for him in ways my mind tried desperately to resist. Because the truth was, the love we once shared hadn't vanished. It had only been buried under years of silence and pain. And now, in the fragile space of his recovery, it was resurfacing. Sometimes, as I sat by his bedside, I would catch his gaze, and the look in his eyes would undo me. It was the same look he used to give me years ago, the one that told me I was seen, I was loved, I was his. And no matter how hard I tried to remind myself of the rules, of the reasons to keep my distance, I couldn't deny the pull between us. I told myself it was temporary, that it was only the intensity of the situation, the late nights, the vulnerability of illness, the shared history, that made the feelings feel stronger than they really were. But deep down I knew the truth. Old love doesn't vanish. It waits quietly for the right moment to breathe again. And in those whispered conversations, in those tender glances, it was breathing. Still, a part of me was afraid. Afraid of what it meant to feel this way again. Afraid of the hospital rules, yes, but more afraid of my own heart. Because letting myself fall for him again meant risking everything. The anger, the heartbreak, the loss that had once destroyed me. But it also meant opening the door to something I had secretly wanted all along. The chance to love him again, even if only in fragments. So we continued those nights, speaking softly, exchanging glances that said more than words ever could. It was dangerous, forbidden, and uncertain, but it was also real. And for the first time in years, I allowed myself to feel it. Just when I thought things were finally getting better, when a fragile kind of hope was starting to take root in my heart, everything changed. His condition suddenly grew worse. The strength he had slowly begun to regain seemed to vanish overnight, leaving him weak and breathless once more. The machines that monitored his body told the story more loudly than words ever could. The steady rhythm of beeps I had grown used to now quickened into an urgent, chaotic pattern. Each sound felt like a warning, each alarm like a scream. My chest tightened as I stood at his bedside, watching the numbers on the screen fluctuate. I had seen this before with other patients, how quickly stability could slip away, how fragile life truly was, but this time it was different. This wasn't just any patient. This was him. This was the man I had once loved, the man I had lost, the man fate had somehow returned to me. And now, in the cruelest twist, I realized that the very night that had brought him back into my life might also be the night that took him away forever. Hope and fear collided violently inside me. Only hours earlier, we had been whispering to each other in the quiet of the ward, letting the old love between us flicker back to life in stolen glances and soft words. I had allowed myself to believe, just for a moment, that maybe we were being given another chance. That maybe life was offering us a fragile miracle, a chance to rewrite the ending we had been denied years ago. But now, watching the machines, listening to the sharp rhythm of his heart struggling against itself, that fragile dream began to crumble. I wanted to be strong, to react the way I always did when a patient's life was in danger. I wanted to slip into the calm focus that defined my work, the steady determination that pushed emotions aside, so I could fight with everything I had to keep someone alive. But this wasn't the same. This time my emotions refused to step aside. They surged forward, clouding my vision, making my hands tremble. This wasn't just a patient on the brink, this was him. Every second felt stretched, as though time itself was slowing down just to make me feel the weight of the moment. The sound of the machines filled the room like a dreadful chorus, each beep echoing the truth I didn't want to face. He was slipping away again. My heart whispered cruel reminders. It reminded me of the first time I had lost him, when he disappeared from my life without a word. It reminded me of the years of pain, the nights I had cried myself to sleep, the emptiness I had carried like a shadow. And now, after fate had thrown him back into my world, was I about to lose him all over again? Was this second chance nothing more than a cruel trick, a fleeting glimpse of what could have been before being ripped away again? I gripped the side of his bed, fighting back tears, forcing myself to focus. He needed me, not as the woman who had once loved him, not as the heartbroken girl who had waited years for answers, but as the doctor who could still try to save him. Yet, even as I tried to summon that strength, another part of me broke inside. Because if he didn't make it through the night, no amount of professionalism or skill could protect me from the truth. I would be left shattered again. The irony was unbearable. The night that had brought him crashing back into my life, the accident, the surgery, the whispers in the dark, was also threatening to be the night that ended everything. Hope and despair wrestled inside me, and I didn't know which one would win. I leaned closer, my hand brushing against his, as though my touch alone could anchor him to this world. My voice trembled as I whispered words I wasn't sure he could even hear. Please don't leave me again. Not like this. Not tonight. And as the machines continued their urgent chorus, I realized that all I could do was fight with everything I had. For him, for us, for the fragile thread of hope that refused to break, even in the face of despair. The doctors gathered around his bed, the air heavy with tension. His condition had worsened so quickly that waiting was no longer an option. The only chance left was surgery, but not just any surgery. It was complicated, dangerous, and filled with risks. One wrong move, one slip of the scalpel, and his heart could stop forever. Everyone in the room knew it. The chief surgeon, a man with decades of experience and countless successful operations behind him, spoke carefully. His voice was steady but carried hesitation. "This is risky," he admitted, his eyes scanning the monitors. "The chances of survival aren't good. If we proceed, we have to be prepared for the worst." His words fell like stones in the room. But as I stood there, watching the man I once loved lying pale and motionless on the table, I felt something ignite inside me. Fear was there, yes, but so was determination. This wasn't just another patient. This wasn't just another case. This was the man who had once held my heart, the man who had walked away to protect me from his illness, the man fate had brought crashing back into my life. I couldn't stand by and let him slip away again. Not now. Not when I had the chance to fight for him. The chief surgeon hesitated, weighing the risks, but I couldn't bear his silence. The words burst out of me before I could stop them. "If anyone can save him, it's me," I said, my voice firm though my hands trembled. "Let me try." In that moment it wasn't just a plea, it was a vow. I was a doctor trained to fight for life, but this was more than duty. This was personal. Every lesson I had ever learned, every skill I had ever practiced, every sleepless night of training had led me here. And now, standing at the edge of losing him, I knew I had to be the one. No one else could fight for him the way I could. The chief surgeon studied me. His eyes filled with conflict. He knew the risks. He knew what it would mean if I failed, not only for the patient but for me. But I didn't waver. My heart screamed louder than my fear. I couldn't let another pair of hands take control. Not when mine were ready. Not when mine were desperate to keep him alive. Inside, my mind replayed everything. The first time I met him in college, the way he smiled at me across crowded rooms, the way he disappeared without explanation, the years I spent wondering why. And now the truth that he had left because of this very heart condition, trying to protect me from a life of pain. How could I let him go again when fate had brought him back into my hands? No, I wouldn't. I refused. So I stood tall, my voice stronger the second time. "Please," I insisted, locking eyes with the chief surgeon. "I know the risks. But I also know him. I won't let him go. Let me do this." The room fell silent. Nurses glanced at each other nervously, the beeping machines filling the air like a countdown. Finally, after what felt like hours, the chief surgeon gave a slow nod. His voice was quiet but firm. "Very well. He's yours. Do everything you can." Relief and terror flooded me all at once. This was it, the moment that would decide everything. My chest tightened with fear, but beneath it burned a fire of determination. I rolled up my sleeves, pulled on my gloves, and steadied my trembling hands. As I prepared for the operation, I whispered silently in my heart, "Hold on. Just hold on for me. I'll fight for you this time. I won't let you go." And with that I stepped forward, ready to battle against death itself. Not just as a doctor, but as a woman who refused to lose the man she loved a second time. The surgery stretched on for what felt like forever. In reality, it was only a few hours, but to me each second dragged like an eternity. Every tick of the clock echoed inside my chest, louder than the monitors, louder than the footsteps of the nurses, louder even than my own breath. My hands were steady on the outside, but inside I was shaking. Fear and determination fought against each other, and I knew I couldn't let the fear win. His life depended on me. My gloves were slick with sweat beneath the fabric, and every time I adjusted an instrument, I reminded myself, "Stay calm. Focus. Do not break." I had trained for this, studied for years, spent countless sleepless nights practicing, and now all of that training came down to this single moment. Yet even with all my experience, this was different. This wasn't just a patient. This was someone who had once held my heart, someone I had never truly stopped loving. That knowledge made the weight on my shoulders even heavier. I whispered silent prayers in my mind as I worked, prayers that begged for his survival. "Please let him live. Please don't take him away from me again." Each time his heartbeat faltered on the monitor, I felt my own heart stumble too. Each time the line steadied, I let myself breathe for a second before plunging back into the fight. There were moments when I thought we were losing him. The beeping sped up, then slowed, then threatened to stop altogether. My hands shook, Not from lack of skill but from the terror that I might lose him in spite of everything I was doing. I could hear the chief surgeon's voice in the background, calm yet firm, guiding when needed, but he had stepped back. He had trusted me to take the lead. That trust was both terrifying and empowering. Time had no meaning. Minutes blurred into hours, but to me, it felt like standing at the edge of forever, staring down a darkness that threatened to swallow us both. My whole being focused on one single truth. I cannot let him die. And then finally it happened. The numbers on the monitor began to steady. His heartbeat, once fragile and uncertain, grew stronger. His breathing evened out. The storm that had raged inside the operating room began to calm. I didn't even realize tears had filled my eyes until they blurred my vision, and I had to blink them away to see clearly. Relief poured through me like a flood, so strong it nearly knocked the strength out of my legs. He lived. Against every fear, against every risk, against the shadow of death that had hung over him, he lived. The weight I had been carrying for hours crushed me the moment it lifted. My shoulders sagged, and I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. My whole body trembled with exhaustion, but beneath that exhaustion was something stronger. Gratitude. Gratitude that he had survived. Gratitude that I hadn't failed him. Gratitude that fate had given me this chance to save him, when once before I had lost him without a choice. I stepped back, letting the team take over the final details, and for the first time in hours, I let myself truly feel the moment. My chest ached, my hands throbbed, but my heart felt alive. I whispered to myself, barely loud enough for anyone to hear. He lived. He truly lived. It wasn't just a statement about his survival, it was a promise. A promise that from this moment forward, every breath he took mattered more than before. That his second chance at life wasn't just his, it was ours. Fate had pulled him back from the edge, and I had been the bridge that carried him across. And in that quiet, heavy moment, I knew that no matter what lay ahead, no matter how fragile his heart remained, we had been given a miracle. That night, something happened that changed everything for me. After the long hours of surgery and the constant fight to keep him alive, he finally opened his eyes fully. His body was still weak, his voice barely more than a whisper, but his presence was real. He looked at me with eyes that carried years of silence, years of distance, and years of pain. Slowly, with trembling fingers, he reached out and held my hand. His grip was not strong, but it was filled with meaning. It carried emotions that words could never fully capture. Regret, longing, hope, and love all mixed together. As his hand rested in mine, I could feel the fragility of his body, the weakness of someone who had just brushed against death. And yet, in that fragile touch, there was strength too. It was the strength of a man who had chosen to return, who had fought to survive, and who was now trying to mend what had once been broken between us. His lips parted, and he whispered words that shook me to my very core. I left once, but if you'll let me, I'll never leave again. Those words echoed in my heart like a bell tolling in a quiet night. They were soft, but they carried the weight of an entire history, the pain of his departure, the years of unanswered questions, the loneliness that had followed me since he walked away. For so long I had wondered why he abandoned me. For so long I had tried to bury the hurt, to convince myself I was stronger without him. But in that moment, hearing those words, I realized that my love for him had never truly disappeared. It had only been buried under layers of anger and sorrow. I looked at him lying there on the hospital bed, pale and fragile, and I felt an ache in my chest that was both painful and healing. Here was the man who once broke me, now asking for another chance. Here was the man I thought I had lost forever, holding my hand as if it was his lifeline. Tears blurred my vision, but I didn't look away. I wanted to remember that moment clearly, the way his eyes softened, the way his voice cracked, the way his hand shook but refused to let go of mine. For the first time in years, I felt something I thought I had lost completely: hope. In that instant, I understood something important. The night duty that had begun in silence and loneliness had not just brought me another patient to care for. It had brought me back a part of my life I thought was gone forever. I had walked into that shift thinking it would be another long, empty night in the hospital. I had expected nothing more than the usual fatigue, the usual solitude, the usual quiet hum of machines. Instead, I was given a reunion I never dared to dream about. The irony was not lost on me. The same night that had started with me feeling isolated, heavy with the emptiness of routine, ended with my hand being held by the man who had once been my world. Fate had a cruel way of writing stories, but sometimes it also gave us chapters we never expected. As I sat beside him, feeling the warmth of his hand in mine, I realized how much my life had changed in just a few hours. The loneliness I carried had been replaced with connection. The bitterness I had stored inside had been replaced with compassion. And the love I thought was buried forever had been brought back to the surface. He was not just a patient anymore. He was the man who once walked away, the man who had returned in the most unexpected way, and the man who was now promising not to leave again. And even though uncertainty still lingered, about his health, about the future, I knew one thing for sure. I had been given back not only his life, but also a piece of my own heart. That night, in the quiet ward of the hospital, I realized that sometimes love doesn't die, even when we think it has. Sometimes it hides, waits, and then returns when fate decides to give it another chance. And in that fragile, beautiful moment, I let myself believe again.